There's little argument that The Legend of Zelda and the franchise it spawned is one of the most important and influential in gaming history. The series is a bit of a blind spot for me. Although I've played a handful of the 3D games, this video is the first time that I've ever played a 2D Zelda game. In this series, I want to fix that. I'm going to play every Zelda game in release order to see where the series came from and how it developed over time. So without any further ado, join me in this first episode of the Evolution of Zelda. Video games in 1986 were a different beast to what they are now. The NES had only just released outside of Japan and wasn't even available in Europe at the time. Coming from the arcade games designed to be played in a single session, home console gaming provided the possibility of longer, more expansive experiences. With games like Metroid, Castlevania and Dragon Quest releasing in the latter half of the year, 1986 was a big year for ambitious games. The Legend of Zelda is an open-world action RPG that I believe would stand up on its own if it was released today. Some of its design might have aged, but it's insane to think that this game is nearly 40 years old. The fact this game with so much content fits onto a 128KB cartridge is impressive. By today's standards, that's a negligible amount of space, but in 1986 it's all the developers had to work with. The Legend of Zelda is a marvel from both a game design and a technical perspective. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It's time to talk about the game itself. The Legend of Zelda is split into two distinct parts. There are 9 dungeons spread around a single connected overworld. The overworld isn't far off what we'd call an open world by today's standards. You can go almost anywhere from the start, and the first 8 dungeons can be challenged in any order, although some of them do require items from previous dungeons to complete. You'll spend a while in the overworld exploring or looking for secrets and the entrances to dungeons. At first it might seem big, but the overworld is tiny. I won't show the full map because I don't want to spoil everything, but it doesn't take long to find your way around. During the beginning of the game, exploring the overworld is about getting your bearings, but towards the end it becomes more about combing through for secrets and navigating to dungeons. Even though it's tiny by today's standards, I like this overworld. It's brimming with secrets and the small size makes it memorable. Besides, if it was much bigger it would be overwhelming to find the areas to progress. My only real complaint is that towards the end of the game you've probably found all of the dungeons, and the overworld becomes reduced to filler as you travel between them. Dungeons are the other half of The Legend of Zelda. These are more constrained areas with a single main goal: kill the boss and claim the Triforce Shard. There's also items hidden around dungeons, some of which are required to complete the game, and others are optional. Dungeons are full of secrets, including hidden rooms that you need to find by using bombs or by pushing specific tiles. Some rooms in dungeons will require a key to enter. These are usually either mandatory routes or rooms containing valuable items. The exception is the final dungeon, a labyrinth full of many locked doors that lead to dead ends. The main challenge in dungeons comes from the attrition of combat. If you die or leave the dungeon, all enemies will respawn and most dungeons are filled with rooms that require you to kill all of the enemies to progress. Towards the end, dungeons can become quite challenging and it can be frustrating to have to leave a dungeon midway through because you ran out of keys or bombs. Especially so when you're exploring later dungeons, which contain gauntlets of difficult encounters. Just because the combat in Zelda is simple doesn't mean it's not difficult. Zelda is a hard game and you'll need every edge you can get to take on some of the later dungeons. In addition to your basic sword attack and the items you pick up along the way, your sword gains a projectile attack while at full health. Since you always respawn with 3 hearts, this makes the first heart container feel like a bit of a downgrade, as when you respawn you'll no longer have access to this attack. Leaving the dungeon to go get your health back feels a little bit like busy work, and I think in a more modern game you'd probably just respawn with all of your health. Despite its simplicity, Zelda's combat remains satisfying throughout its playtime. Partially this is because of the smooth difficulty curve, which gradually throws more challenging encounters at you. At the start you can mindlessly swing your way through dungeons, but as you progress you'll have to learn to use all of the tools at your disposal in a fight. I particularly like how the shield lets you block projectiles from the front. It rewards you for careful positioning and provides an alternative to just dodging. It's not just the well designed mechanics that make the combat great, but also the huge enemy variety. In general, each enemy comes in 2 varieties, red and blue. Blue enemies usually have more health and do more damage than their red counterparts, but for the most part behave similarly. Every enemy type requires different strategies to defeat, and while some are difficult to take out on their own, the interesting encounters are the ones where several types of enemies are thrown at you together. Methodically taking out a room full of blue dark nuts becomes much harder when you need to dodge or block projectiles at the same time. Although bosses test some of the same skills as combat, most bosses must be defeated using specific items or strategies. This makes bosses more into puzzles than fights, however the game does give you hints to defeat each boss if you look for them. Paradoxically, this usually means that when a boss recurs, it's easier than most normal enemies, since they're usually trivial to defeat once you know the trick. None of the boss fights are particularly memorable, but considering the limited mechanics within the game, they're all serviceable. Zelda's gameplay is at its best when you're exploring or uncovering secrets. It's a game that's full of secrets, and even though I found most of them, there are some big ones that I completely missed. It's cryptic by today's standards, but that's part of the charm. The secrets I find will be different to the ones that you find. There are some hints to help you along the way, although most of them are vague. Due to the poor localization, some of them are almost useless. No one online seems to agree on what they're referring to. Around halfway through the game, it starts requiring you to find secret entrances using bombs. At first, I thought it was going too far. Having beat the game, I now disagree. I'm not entirely sure what to chalk it up to, but by the end of the game, I developed a sense for which walls could be bombed and which couldn't. I was finding secret entrances more often than not. It does mean you can get stuck for a long time, but I enjoy how the game never holds your hand. I think the game would lose something if it was more afraid of players getting lost. In addition to secrets, there are some more traditional puzzles along the way. These are mostly simple by today's standards. Sometimes, like in the forest maze, the solution is just to find the hint that tells you the answer. Despite that, I do like these puzzles. They're rare enough that they're not too obtrusive, and they add some extra flair to the world. Navigating the forest maze never got old for me. I always got a buzz out of hearing that jingle. One of the main reasons to hunt for secrets is to find rare items and upgrades. You could find money, heart containers to increase your HP, along with some other items. Some items are required for progression, while some are completely optional. There's also a few upgrades, like the blue ring which lowers incoming damage, or magical sword which lets you deal more damage. These upgrades are technically optional, but even with them the final dungeon is difficult. It would be a nightmare without them. Some upgrades change the functionality of existing items. What's interesting is that due to the open nature of the game, it's possible to get these upgrades before the original items. I got the Book of Magic before the Magic Rod, which meant I never used the unupgraded version. At the time I was confused by what the book did, and I only realised it was an upgrade after I beat the game and looked it up. As well as combat items, there's also a couple to help you navigate the world. The stepladder lets you cross one-tile gaps, and the recorder lets you teleport to the entrances of dungeons. These aren't that useful, but the stepladder does open up a few new routes to navigate the overworld. Since the world is so small, the fast travel provided by the recorder is unnecessary. I barely used it. Some items, such as bombs, potions and keys, can be bought for rupees. There are times where you need these items to progress, particularly bombs which are required for navigation in later dungeons. I found myself sometimes having to grind for extra rupees, which wasn't a great experience. A lot of that is probably down to me wasting them earlier, when I didn't know what I was doing, but it's still something I could have done without. A particularly annoying case of this is with a magical shield, an upgraded version of the shield which lets you block most projectiles. There's an enemy which can destroy the shield, requiring you to buy it again. Some rooms are very difficult to clear without the shield, so when it breaks you have to leave the dungeon, grind the rupees and then come back. This breaks the flow. There weren't many cases of needing to grind rupees, but it still felt like an unnecessary mechanic. The scope of this game is impressive considering its age and the limitations of the NES. From a technical perspective, there's a lot of content here, even if it's clear at times how they've taken shortcuts. They even managed to create a New Game Plus mode with entirely new dungeons. From a design perspective, this game is surprisingly cohesive. Almost everything feels like it fits together and is well considered. There are only a few places where the design feels dated. That said, Zelda does sometimes show its age. It can be repetitive, and there are quite a lot of puzzles which are repeated throughout the game. There's almost no story to speak of. What little story there is comes from text on the title screen, rather than in the game itself. The puzzles in this game are obscure. Some of them don't have clear solutions and require a bit of trial and error to find. Finally, death and respawning in this game is handled a bit strangely. If you die, you respawn at the start of the overworld with free health, but if you die in a dungeon, you instead respawn at the start of the dungeon. This can mean that it's advantageous to go into a dungeon and intentionally die to get your health back. To some extent, these issues are the cost of innovation. Zelda is a fantastic game, and one I'll be remembering for a long time. More than anything else, it has a ton of charm. I love the chiptune music and all of the sound effects. The music is great, it looks nice, the gameplay is unique, it really has a lot going for it. I was half expecting this game to be horribly dated, but actually, I really enjoyed it. One thing that added to the charm is the bad English localization. All over the game there's clumsily worded sentences and poor grammar. This would never make its way into a modern game. Obviously, poor localization isn't a good thing, but it is memorable, and sometimes funny. I'm glad I decided to check out The Legend of Zelda. It still feels fresh today, and I can't imagine how groundbreaking it must have been back in 1986. I think if it was an indie game released today, it would still hold up. Next time, I'm going to be taking a look at Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. I'm not sure what to expect, but I'm excited to see more of the series. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you all next time.